The power died at midnight, and the whole dorm went black. Someone knocked on my door, breathless, holding an empty phone. "Do you have a flashlight?" she asked, rain still in her hair. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know anything yet. 3 months later, I would love her more than my own family. 6 months later, I would almost lose her to a lie. 1 year later, I would have to choose her or everyone else. This is how it started, with a knock and a flashlight. My name is Reagan Walsh, and before that October night, I thought I knew exactly who I was and where my life was headed. I was 20 years old, a sophomore at Marion State University in Ohio, raised Catholic, raised careful, raised to never ask certain questions about myself. I worked as a study hall proctor in Callahan Hall, the oldest dorm on campus, mostly to pay for textbooks and stay out of my own head. That night a storm knocked out power across half the county, and half my floor panicked like the world was ending over a simple blackout. I grabbed the proctor's emergency flashlight and started checking rooms, knocking on doors, making sure no one was stuck alone in the dark. Room 214 opened before I even knocked, and a girl stood there in a paint-stained hoodie, hair dripping from a run across the quad. "I'm Dakota," she said. Like that explained the paint, the rain, and the way she was smiling despite the dark. "I just moved in Tuesday." She transferred from a small art college in California, chasing a painting program, and she hadn't unpacked a single flashlight or candle. I lent her mine and sat on her windowsill while we waited for the power, talking about nothing, professors, dining hall food, the storm outside. She sketched my silhouette by phone light without asking permission, working fast, like she wanted to memorize me before I left the room. When the lights came back on at 2 in the morning, neither of us moved for a full minute, like we both wanted the dark to stay. I told myself it meant nothing, that I was just being a good proctor, that plenty of neighbors talked to each other during storms. By the end of that week I'd found 4 reasons to knock on 214, a missing textbook, a fire drill notice, nothing that truly mattered. Dakota started leaving her door propped open in the evenings, and I started noticing I looked for that open door every single night. We fell into a routine without ever naming it: coffee before her 9 a.m. class, the dining hall at 6, the library until closing. She painted while I studied, propping her easel by my desk, claiming my highlighter colors gave her better ideas than any tube of paint. I hadn't laughed that easily with anyone since high school, back when laughing didn't feel like something I had to explain to myself later. My roommate Priya teased me about the artist girl, and I laughed it off, even as my stomach tightened at the way she said it. Dakota told me about her mother, a gallery owner in Sacramento who loved her art but never once asked who she loved back. I didn't offer the same in return, because at home in Cincinnati, that question wasn't something anyone in my family had ever dared to ask. My phone buzzed most nights with texts from Tyler, my on and off boyfriend since junior year of high school, asking when I'd finally come visit. I told him I was busy with midterms, which was true, and also the smallest fraction of the truth I was willing to admit. One night Dakota showed me the painting she'd made from that first blackout, my silhouette, but softened, lit gold instead of gray and cold. "You looked like you were waiting for something," she said quietly, not looking at me, like the words cost her something to say out loud. I didn't answer. I just stared at the painting and felt something shift in my chest that I had no name ready for yet. We started walking the long way back from the library, past the quad, past the chapel, taking 20 extra minutes neither of us mentioned. She told me she was gay, plainly, over vending machine coffee, like it was just another fact about herself, no different than her hometown. I nodded and said something forgettable, terrified she'd hear the way my heart had started slamming against my ribs at the word. That night I lay awake replaying every conversation, every laugh, every long look, searching for proof I'd only imagine what I was starting to feel. I called my mother the next morning and talked about nothing, weather, classes, Tyler, anything except the girl down the hall I couldn't stop thinking about. Dakota invited me to her friend's art show downtown, and I said yes before I'd even finished hearing the question. We stood in front of a painting of two women dancing, and she asked, too casually, what I thought love was supposed to look like. I said something safe about commitment and loyalty, the answer my mother would have wanted, and Dakota just smiled like she saw straight through it. On the walk home she reached for my hand crossing the street, then let go too fast, like she'd caught herself doing something reckless. I missed her hand the second it was gone, and that missing scared me more than anything that had happened all semester. Tyler called again, asking about Thanksgiving, asking when I'd wear the promise ring his mother had already started mentioning to my mother. I told him I needed to focus on school, and for the first time, the excuse felt less like a lie and more like a wall. Dakota got quiet for a week after the art show, painting less, talking less, like she was pulling back from a ledge she'd almost stepped off. I finally asked her what was wrong, standing in her doorway, and she said, I think I like you. And I think that's a problem. I didn't say anything for a long moment, and she nodded like my silence was the answer she'd already braced herself to hear. It's not a problem, I finally said, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. I just don't know what to do with it. She smiled, small and careful, and said we didn't have to know yet, that some things could just exist without a plan attached. We started spending nights in her room watching old films, shoulders touching, neither of us moving away, both of us too aware of the space between. One night during a rerun of a black and white movie, she fell asleep against my shoulder, and I stayed frozen for 2 hours, afraid to breathe. I started dreaming about her. Nothing dramatic, just her laugh, her paint-stained fingers, the way she said my name like it mattered. Priya noticed the change in me before I admitted it to myself, catching me smiling at my phone at 2 in the morning. You like her, she said one night. Not a question. And I didn't deny it, just sat there letting the truth settle in the room. I told Priya to keep it between us, terrified of what would happen if the wrong person heard it before I understood it myself. Dakota and I never talked about labels, but we started holding hands on quiet walks, fingers laced loosely, like a secret only the campus dark could keep. The first time she kissed me was outside the chapel. Ironically, under a streetlight, snow just starting to fall on both our shoulders. I kissed her back before my mind could catch up to what my body already understood. And for one moment nothing else in the world existed. I've wanted to do that since the blackout, she whispered, forehead against mine. And I laughed because I'd wanted the exact same thing. Walking back to the dorm that night, I felt lighter than I had in years, like a weight I hadn't named was finally setting down. I broke things off with Tyler over the phone, vague on details, telling him only that I'd changed and he deserved someone who hadn't. He asked if there was someone else, and I said no. The first real lie I told for Dakota's sake, though far from the last. My mother called 2 days later, furious, saying Tyler's mother had phoned in tears, asking what on earth had gotten into her daughter. I told her I just needed space to figure myself out, and she said figuring myself out had never required breaking a good boy's heart before. Dakota and I kept our relationship small and quiet. Just us. Just Priya. A secret folded carefully into the corners of an ordinary semester. She started leaving little sketches under my door, my hands around a coffee cup, my profile bent over a textbook, evidence of how closely she watched me. I kept every single one in a shoebox under my bed, too afraid to hang them where anyone visiting my room might ask who drew them. For the first time in my life, I understood what people meant when they said falling in love felt like finally exhaling after years of held breath. I still hadn't told my family anything real, but for a few golden weeks, none of that felt urgent enough to ruin what we had. Winter break arrived too fast, and Dakota flew home to Sacramento while I drove back to Cincinnati, dreading every mile of the familiar highway. My house still had a welcome home banner from high school graduation, faded now, hanging in the same spot it had hung for 2 years. My mother asked about Tyler at dinner the first night, and my father said nothing, just watched me with the quiet disappointment I knew too well. I texted Dakota under the table. Small updates, small jokes, desperate for anything that reminded me who I actually was outside that house. My little brother Mason found one of her texts on my unlocked phone and asked, too innocently, who Dee was and why I smiled at my screen. I told him she was just a friend from school, and he shrugged and let it go. 12 years old and thankfully uninterested in details. My mother, however, was not 12, and not uninterested, and she'd seen the same message glowing on my phone across the dinner table. She didn't say anything that night, but I saw the question sitting behind her eyes, sharp and waiting, like a blade she hadn't decided to use yet. Christmas Eve. Church. I sat between my parents and mouthed the words to hymns I no longer fully believed, thinking only of a girl in California. Dakota called after midnight, whispering so her own family wouldn't hear, and told me she missed me more than she thought was reasonable this early. Me too, I whispered back, curled under blankets in my childhood bedroom, feeling like two completely different people living in one exhausted body. On New Year's Eve, my mother finally asked, flatly, if there was something I needed to tell her. Her voice steady but her hands shaking slightly. I panicked and said no, that everything was fine, that I was just stressed about finals, burying the truth deeper instead of letting it breathe. She didn't push further. But something cooled between us that night. A distance I recognized because I'd built it myself, brick by careful brick. I counted down the days until I could drive back to campus, back to a version of myself I didn't have to constantly translate. The morning I left, my mother hugged me longer than usual and said, quietly, whatever it is, Reagan, I hope you know I love you anyway. I didn't answer with the truth, just hugged her back and told her I loved her too, and drove away before either of us could say more. Back at Marion State, Dakota was waiting outside Callahan Hall in the cold. No coat, just a smile that made the whole drive worth it. She kissed me right there on the sidewalk, in front of anyone who cared to look. And for the first time I didn't flinch or check who saw. Spring semester started with a new energy between us, less careful, less hidden in doorways, more willing to exist in daylight without apology. We started eating dinner together in the dining hall, no longer hiding behind study excuses, just two people who clearly wanted to be near each other. Priya became our unofficial cover story for group texts and family calls, a friend name I could say out loud without anyone asking further questions. Dakota's roommate transferred out in February, and slowly, without much discussion, half my things migrated down the hall into her side of room 214. We adopted a routine so domestic it almost scared me, her coffee order memorized, my laundry folded on her bed, keys traded like small promises. I started to believe, foolishly maybe, that this quiet campus bubble could just keep expanding forever, untouched by anyone outside its walls. Then Dakota's brother, Marcus, transferred into my Tuesday economics seminar, and introduced himself before I even connected the last name to her face. He was 2 years older, sharp, observant, and within the first week he'd noticed how often his sister's name came up in my notebook margins. "You're the flashlight girl," he said one afternoon after class, not unkindly, just matter of fact, like he'd heard the whole story already from Dakota herself. I laughed nervously and asked what else she'd told him, and he said enough to know I made his sister happier than she'd been in years. For a moment I let myself relax, thinking maybe this was one person outside our bubble who would simply be glad for us both. But Marcus mentioned, almost offhand, that their mother still didn't fully know, that Dakota kept certain details soft and vague in every phone call home. That night I asked Dakota directly, and she admitted her mother knew she liked women in theory, but had never met anyone she was seriously dating. "It's different when it's real," she said, picking at the edge of her sketchbook. "When it's a person with a name and a future." I understood that fear better than she probably realized, since I hadn't told my own family anything close to the full truth either. We made a quiet pact that night. We'd tell our families eventually, in our own time, without pressuring each other toward anyone's timeline. For a while, that pact felt like enough, like two people building something private and strong before letting the outside world weigh in on it. Then my mother announced, over a Sunday phone call, that she and my father were driving up for Parents' Weekend at the end of April. I panicked internally while agreeing out loud, already calculating which parts of my life would need to be quietly hidden for 48 hours. Dakota offered to disappear for the weekend, to give me space. But the thought of hiding her like a secret made me feel sick with shame. "I don't want to hide you," I told her, surprising myself with how much I meant it. "I just need more time to figure out how." She said she understood, though I could see something flicker behind her eyes, a tiredness I hadn't noticed building until that exact moment. Parents' Weekend arrived, and I introduced Dakota as my roommate's friend, a lie so thin I could feel it cracking the second I said it. My mother, sharp as ever, noticed the shoebox of sketches half hidden under my bed, and asked, too casually, who the artist was. I said Dakota, quickly, and changed the subject to the dining hall's new coffee machine, my heart pounding loud enough I was sure she could hear it. That night, alone in my room, my mother sat on the edge of my bed and asked if Dakota was more than just a friend. I froze, torn between 2 years of careful hiding and 1 semester of finally feeling like myself, and chose, that night, to keep hiding. "She's just a close friend," I said, and watched something in my mother's face settle, though I couldn't tell if it was relief or disbelief. My parents left Sunday afternoon, and I collapsed onto Dakota's bed the moment they drove off campus, exhausted from an entire weekend of performance. She held me without saying much, and I could feel the hurt in her silence, the weight of being called just a friend out loud. "I'm sorry," I whispered into her shoulder, and she said it was okay, though her voice carried an edge I hadn't heard from her before. Over the next 2 weeks, something shifted between us, small distances, delayed texts, a quietness that hadn't existed in our routine before that weekend. I told myself it was just final stress, both of us buried in papers and exams, no time or energy left over for anything else. But late one night, Dakota asked if I was ever planning to tell my parents the truth, or if close friend was simply my final answer. I didn't have a good response, and my silence stretched long enough that she got up, put on her shoes, and said she needed air. I let her go, telling myself space was healthy, not admitting that some part of me was relieved to avoid the conversation a little longer. 2 days later, Marcus texted me, worried, saying Dakota hadn't answered his calls and had been sketching alone in the art building until midnight for a week. I found her there, surrounded by half-finished canvases, all of them, somehow, versions of the same stormlit window from our very first night. "I can't keep being a secret you rehearse excuses for," she said, not looking up from her paintbrush, voice steady but clearly on the edge of breaking. "I'm not ashamed of you," I said, and she finally looked at me, as tired, and said, "Then why does it always sound like you are?" I didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound like an excuse, so I stood there in silence while something between us quietly, painfully cracked. We didn't break up that night, but we didn't fully repair things either. Just agreed to keep trying, though the trying suddenly felt heavier. Finals ended, and Dakota flew home for the summer while I took a research job on campus, telling my parents it was for my resume. The truth was I couldn't face a whole summer at home, pretending. After everything that had shifted between Dakota and me that spring, we texted daily, called on Sundays, but the distance made the cracks feel wider. each unanswered message stretching longer than it should have. In July, my mother visited campus unannounced for a work conference nearby and stopped by my dorm room without any warning at all. She found the shoebox of sketches again, this time going through them slowly, studying each one like she was piecing together a story I'd never told her. When I walked in, she was holding a drawing of my hands specifically, rendered with a tenderness no close friend bothers with. "Reagan," she said quietly, not angry, just tired. "I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Right now." I sat down across from her, my heart pounding, and for the first time in 20 years, I told my mother exactly who I was. I told her about the blackout, the flashlight, the sketches, the kiss outside the chapel, every piece of the truth I'd been hiding for months. She was quiet for a long time, turning the drawing over in her hands, and finally said, "I need time. I don't know what to do with this yet." She left that afternoon without another word about it, and I sat alone in my room feeling both terrified and, strangely, finally light. I called Dakota that night, shaking, and told her everything, that I'd finally said the truth out loud, even if it hadn't gone perfectly. She cried on the phone, relieved, and said that was the bravest thing she'd ever heard me do, even with the ending still uncertain. My father called 2 days later, his voice careful and formal, saying my mother had told him everything and they needed time to process it. I braced myself for anger, for ultimatums, but instead he just said, quietly, "You're still my daughter. We just need to catch up to this." It wasn't a full acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. And for the first time, I let myself believe my family might eventually come around. Dakota came to visit me in Cincinnati in August, nervous, holding a small gift for my mother, hoping to prove she wasn't a phase or a mistake. My mother was polite but distant at dinner, asking careful questions, watching Dakota the way you watch weather that might turn at any moment. Afterward, alone in my room, Dakota asked if it had helped or hurt, and I honestly didn't know, only that it hadn't gotten worse. We drove back to campus together that August, the car full of boxes and cautious hope, both of us older than we'd been in May. Junior year started, and things between us slowly stabilized, the secrecy replaced by something steadier, even if my family still felt hesitant and unsure. Then, in October, almost exactly a year after the blackout, an old classmate posted a photo of us kissing outside the chapel to a campus forum. The caption was cruel, mocking, tagging both our names, and within hours it had spread across half the university's social media accounts. I found out through Priya, who called me white-faced, telling me to check my phone before I heard about it from someone crueler. My stomach dropped as I read comment after comment, some supportive, many not. All of it public in a way I'd never chosen or agreed to. Worse, someone had tagged my mother's old Facebook profile in the thread, ensuring the news reached my family before I could explain it myself. My phone rang within the hour, my mother, furious. Not at the situation itself but at learning it from strangers instead of from me. "I was going to tell you when I was ready," I said, crying. And she said, "Ready doesn't mean I find out from the internet. Reagan." Dakota was shaking beside me, guilt written across her face, insisting the post was somehow her fault for kissing me somewhere so public. "It's not your fault," I told her, though privately I wondered if a year of careful hiding had made this explosion inevitable either way. The university's Title IX office reached out, offering support, and the classmate who posted it was eventually made to take it down and apologize. But the apology didn't undo the damage, not to my mother's trust, and not to the fragile privacy Dakota and I had worked hard to protect. Marcus found out through the same post and called Dakota, furious on her behalf, threatening to confront the classmate himself if she wanted him to. Dakota asked him not to, saying she just wanted it to disappear quietly, though nothing about the situation felt quiet anymore. That week, Tyler resurfaced, texting me out of nowhere, saying he'd seen the post and that it explained a lot about our breakup. I didn't respond, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of an explanation he hadn't earned and honestly didn't deserve from me anymore. My mother stopped answering my calls for nearly 2 weeks, and the silence felt heavier than any argument we could have had instead. Dakota tried to comfort me, but I pulled away without meaning to, drowning in guilt over a secret that was never really mine to keep from her. "You're punishing me for something I didn't do," Dakota said one night, and I realized, painfully, that she was right, and I apologized immediately. We sat together that night, both exhausted, both scared, and agreed that whatever happened with my family, we wouldn't let it destroy what we'd built. Slowly, my father started texting again first. Small updates about home, nothing about the post, but a bridge rebuilding one message at a time. My mother finally called in November, her voice quieter than usual, and said she wanted to understand, even if she didn't fully yet. I told her about Dakota properly this time, not confessions, but real stories. The paintings, the laughter, the way she made me feel like myself. My mother listened longer than she ever had before, and at the end said, "I still have questions, but I don't want to lose you over them." It wasn't everything, but it was more than I'd let myself hope for during those 2 silent, painful weeks after the post went viral. Thanksgiving approached, and my mother, hesitantly, asked if Dakota would like to come, an invitation that felt enormous coming from her. Dakota was terrified, certain it was a trap, but I told her I believed my mother was trying, in her own careful, imperfect way. We drove to Cincinnati together, quieter than the ride in August. Both of us braced for a dinner that could go either direction entirely. My grandmother, visiting from Kentucky, hadn't been told anything, and I panicked, certain the whole fragile progress would collapse over turkey and stuffing. Halfway through dinner, my grandmother asked Dakota, bluntly, how long she and I had been an item, as if it were the most ordinary question possible. The table went silent, forks frozen, until my grandmother added, "I'm old, not blind." "You two look at each other exactly how your grandfather looked at me." My mother laughed, shocked and relieved, breaking the tension that had built for months, and something in the room finally, genuinely softened. After dinner, my mother pulled me aside and admitted she'd been terrified of losing the daughter she thought she knew. Not of me directly. "I don't understand everything," she said, "but I understand you're happier than I've seen you in years. And maybe that has to be enough for now." I hugged her longer than I had in years, feeling, for the first time since the blackout, like I didn't have to split myself in two. Dakota and my father talked quietly on the porch afterward, and later he told me, gruffly, that she seemed like good people, which from him meant everything. We drove back to campus that Sunday lighter than we'd arrived. The storm we'd been bracing for finally, unexpectedly, starting to clear. December brought finals again, but this time there were no secrets folded into our schedules, no lies rehearsed before phone calls home. Dakota's mother finally met me over winter break, flying out for one weekend, watching me carefully before pulling me into an unexpectedly warm hug. "She's talked about you since October last year," her mother said, smiling. "I just needed to see for myself who deserved all that talking." By spring, my mother started asking about Dakota unprompted. Small questions, genuine ones, the kind that meant she was truly trying to understand. Marcus graduated that May, and at his ceremony, Dakota cried happy tears while I held her hand in front of both our families, unhidden. I realized, watching them together, how far we'd come from a girl knocking on my door during a blackout, asking to borrow a flashlight, That summer, Dakota asked if I'd move into her apartment near campus for senior year. And I said yes before she'd even finished the question. We painted the walls together, argued over color choices, and hung the shoebox sketches proudly on the wall instead of hiding them underneath the bed. My mother visited that fall and complimented the apartment, lingering longest in front of the painting from our very first blackout night together. "You kept this?" she asked Dakota. And Dakota said she'd never once considered not keeping it, because it was where everything real had started. Senior year passed differently than the years before it, steadier, lighter, full of ordinary Tuesday dinners instead of carefully managed performances. At graduation, my entire family sat together in the stands, and Dakota's family sat right beside them, cheering as if we'd always been one family. Afterward, in the parking lot, my mother hugged Dakota tightly and said, "Welcome to the family," properly this time, and I finally let myself cry. I thought about that first night constantly, the storm, the knock, the flashlight, never guessing it would lead to an entire rebuilt life. I learned that courage isn't one dramatic moment, but 1,000 small ones. A hand held in public, a truth spoken at a dinner table. 2 years after a blackout brought us together, I finally understood that the light I'd lent her that night was really the one she gave back to me. Then